What if the person you mocked, humiliated, and dragged in front of a courtroom turned out to be the very judge who had the power to decide your future? The insult came like a knife. Dirty animals like you don't belong in courthouses. Officer Daniel Mercer spat the words as his palm struck across Naomi Carter's face. The blow forced her head sideways, her cheek burning hot while the papers from her briefcase scattered across the courthouse steps like tossed confetti. Stay with this story, because what happens next is a reminder that no matter who you are or what uniform you wear, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Make sure to watch until the end and don't forget to like and share so others can see how justice really works. Before she could gather herself, Mercer shoved her against the cold stone wall. The sharp click of handcuffs sealed her wrists in steel. His breath reeked of stale coffee and cigarettes, but worse was the contempt in his voice as he repeated the word, animals, stretching it as though humiliation was his form of power. Just a few steps away, two other officers, Victor Hale and Brian Collins, stood watching. Neither moved to stop him. Instead, they smirked, phones raised, pretending to document what looked like a victory instead of an abuse. Legal documents and subpoenas slid beneath their boots, some blowing into the air before floating back down in the autumn wind. This ugly display happened right outside the very doors that bore a polished brass plaque. The Honorable Judge Naomi Carter presiding. Naomi did not fight back. Instead, her eyes locked on that plaque. Just 20 steps separated her from the bench she had commanded for more than 2 decades. 20 steps between dignity and disgrace. She inhaled deeply, pulling calm into her chest, holding the pain still in her mind. Inside the courtroom, Judge Edward Grant had been told that a disruptive woman had been caught near a restricted area. Known as a man who trusted officers more than suspects, he gave a quick signal to the stenographer, nodded at Rachel Myers at the prosecutor's table, and tapped his gavel to begin session. The doors swung open. Mercer marched Naomi inside, a middle-aged black woman, her face bruised, her hair neatly tied back, her eyes burning with controlled fire. "Your Honor," Mercer began confidently, "during a routine security sweep, I encountered this suspicious individual attempting to enter a restricted area. She was carrying what looked like stolen documents. When asked to comply, she resisted, used profanity, and threatened me. I was forced to use minimum necessary force to ensure safety." He held up his phone, showing a conveniently clipped video. The screen displayed only the moment when Naomi's arm jerked, taken out of context. "My body cam malfunctioned this morning," Mercer added smoothly, glancing at Hale and Collins. They nodded in agreement, their faces blank as stone. Naomi sat quietly at the defense table, her cuffed hands folded neatly. Her eyes stayed fixed on the screen. Then she whispered, just loud enough for Mercer to hear, "How convenient." Judge Grant's eyes narrowed. "What was that?" "Nothing, Your Honor," Naomi replied calmly. But her gaze never left Mercer, marking every lie that rolled off his tongue. The courtroom whispered. Some clerks shook their heads, muttering, "She's playing the race card again." Others instinctively leaned toward the officer's side. Only one person in the gallery, a young clerk named Elena Brooks, sat upright, uneasy. Something about Naomi's steady tone and choice of words sent a shiver down her spine. Elena had heard that voice every morning in the hallway asking, "What's on the docket today?" But her thought flickered and died as the trial pressed on. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Myers rose. "The prosecution charges this woman with trespassing, obstruction of an officer, and fraudulent impersonation by carrying documents marked with judicial seals." Hale stepped forward. "She claimed to be someone important to get past security." Collins quickly added, "She resisted restraint and tried to run." The story unfolded like a rehearsed chorus, each officer adding their part. Mercer ended it with a sneer aimed at Naomi. "People like her always play the victim card. Not in my courthouse." The gavel cracked. Judge Grant's voice cut through the noise. "Does the defendant have anything to say?" Naomi lifted her head. There was no anger, no begging, just the sharp clarity of someone who had heard this narrative countless times before. She stood, chains clinking softly, and spoke with precision. "Your Honor, I need to correct several falsehoods in Officer Mercer's testimony." The room grew still. Next leaned forward. Even the fluorescent lights seemed harsher, the steady clack of the stenographer's keys echoing like dry beats. "First," Naomi said firmly, "I was walking on a public sidewalk leading to the main entrance at 8:47 this morning. The Supreme Court has long established that sidewalks near government buildings are public forums. There were no signs, no restricted orders, no barricades. The trespassing charge is baseless. Second, the so-called stolen documents are official case files, memoranda, and communications that I have legal access to as part of my work. Calling them stolen is defamation. Third, regarding profanity, I was assaulted without cause. Any words I may have said were in response to being slapped in front of the courthouse." Judge Grant leaned back, watching closely. Naomi continued, turning toward the prosecution. "I request preservation of evidence. This building is covered by high-definition cameras every 15 feet. Officer body cams upload to the county server every 60 seconds, regardless of supposed malfunctions. I demand an immediate preservation order for security footage, backup logs, and all officer phone recordings from 8:45 to 9:15 a.m. Myers shot up. "Objection. The defendant has no standing to make motions." But Naomi's voice held steady. "Every defendant has the right to present arguments and request evidence in their favor. Under Brady v. Maryland, the prosecution is obligated to preserve and disclose such evidence. Device malfunctions are not exceptions." The courtroom stirred again. Mercer stood rigid, a bead of sweat forming at his temple. Judge Grant asked sharply, "Do you have legal training?" Naomi allowed a thin smile. "Dr. Naomi Carter," she said evenly. "My credentials speak for themselves." She gestured to the briefcase. "Allow me to identify the so-called suspicious documents." Myers hesitated, then nodded. Naomi opened the case and carefully displayed a court calendar stamped with the judicial seal. Judge Naomi Carter, 9 a.m. hearing, Peterson case. Next came a judicial parking pass, an access card coded to chamber doors, and finally, a badge embossed with a gold seal. The bailiff, Thomas Green, who had greeted Naomi every morning for 3 years, stood frozen. His face drained of color. "Your Honor," he whispered, realization crashing over him. The room froze. Naomi's calm eyes met his. "Do what's right." And with those words, the entire courtroom began to feel the first crack in the officer's carefully built wall of lies. The silence in the courtroom stretched, heavy enough to make even the fluorescent lights seem louder. Every eye shifted between Naomi Carter and the documents laid neatly before her, proof of who she was and what role she held. The humiliation Mercer had forced on her now stood against him like a mirror that could not be broken. Bailiff Thomas Green straightened his shoulders, swallowing hard. He had greeted Naomi every morning with a polite, "Good morning, Your Honor." Now guilt clouded his face. But Naomi gave him a slight nod, her calm presence instructing him without words, "Stand on the side of truth." Judge Edward Grant cleared his throat, obviously unsettled. He motioned to the stenographer. "Let the record reflect the defendant's claim of judicial authority and the documents presented for identification." His voice was firm, but his eyes betrayed doubt. Assistant District Attorney Rachel Myers quickly rose, her heels clicking against the polished floor. "Your Honor, the prosecution requests a short recess to verify the defendant's claims. Until then, the charges remain in place." Naomi spoke with controlled precision. "I will not oppose a recess, but the preservation order for all evidence must be signed immediately. Every passing second risks data overwrite." Grant hesitated, then nodded toward the stenographer. "Record the preservation order as requested." The gavel struck lightly. "Court will recess for 15 minutes. The sound of hurried whispers filled the chamber. Mercer's jaw tightened as he glanced nervously at Hale and Collins. They muttered among themselves, checking their phones before tucking them away quickly. The air was no longer on their side. Naomi was escorted to a small side chamber while the main court erupted in confusion. Behind closed doors, she leaned against the wall, breathing slowly. Her mind lined up each step like chess pieces: preservation orders, evidence sealing, camera logs, and backup retrieval. Procedure was her shield now. Moments later the door opened. Bailiff Green entered carrying a garment bag and a wooden case. His voice trembled. I didn't realize who you were. I'm sorry. Naomi placed a gentle hand on his shoulder. You didn't fail me. You still have a chance to do the right thing. Announce it properly when we return. He nodded firmly. His shame was replaced with resolve. Naomi opened the wooden case. Inside, cushioned in velvet, lay a gavel engraved with the words, "Justice is blind, but she sees all." Its weight grounded her as she held it. She reached for the black robe in the garment bag, its fabric cascading across her shoulders. The transformation was not just clothing, it was authority reclaiming its rightful place. She looked in the mirror. The bruise on her cheek was still visible, a harsh mark of the morning's violence. Yet, in that moment it no longer felt like a wound. It was a seal of truth. She counted silently to 3, preparing the strength in her voice. When Green returned, he stood taller. His words were steady. "It's time, Your Honor." Naomi nodded. "Let's proceed." The courtroom buzzed with restless energy as the recess ended. Lawyers shuffled papers, clerks whispered nervously, and the officers sat stiff, their confidence eroding by the second. Suddenly the command rang out, "All rise." Court is now in session. The Honorable Judge Naomi Carter presiding. Gasps swept through the gallery. Ada Rachel Myers froze mid-motion, her notebook slipping slightly in her hand. Officers Hale and Collins fumbled with their phones, their earlier smirks wiped away. Ann Mercer, Officer Daniel Mercer, sat paralyzed, realizing the weight of what had just been revealed. Even Judge Grant, who had been sitting at the bench moments earlier, rose in shock, quickly stepping aside. His face burned red as he realized he had been occupying the wrong seat of power. Naomi entered the room, draped in her black robe, the gavel firm in her hand. Every step she took echoed against the wooden floor like thunder rolling through the chamber. The bruise on her face stood out beneath the lights, yet it carried a new meaning: evidence, authority, and unshakable dignity. She seated herself at the bench, the place that had always been hers. Placing the gavel neatly in front of her, she swept her gaze across the room. Her eyes landed on Mercer. "Officer Mercer," she began, her tone sharp and steady, "2 hours ago, you stood here and swore an oath before this court. You gave testimony under that oath. Let me remind you of your own words." She tapped the tablet before her. The large screen flickered to life. A recording from courthouse security cameras filled the display, Naomi in plain clothes walking toward the entrance. Mercer blocked her path. The slap, the shove, the handcuffs. His voice cut through the audio, "Dirty animals like you don't belong in courthouses." The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Hands flew to mouths. Naomi's voice sliced through the noise. "Do you hear any profanity from me in this video?" Mercer stayed silent. "Any resistance? Any threats?" Again silence. She froze the footage at the exact moment the cuffs clamped onto her wrists, the red marks stark against her skin. Then she swiped to another file, Mercer's body cam backup, automatically uploaded to the county server. The angle was closer, the audio clearer. Mercer's sneering voice filled the courtroom. "Look at this uppity woman thinking she can just walk into my courthouse. People like her need to learn their place." Ada Myers stiffened. Hale and Collins shifted uneasily. Naomi turned her gaze to them. "Officers Hale and Collins, you confirmed under oath that this was proper procedure. Would you like to revise your testimony before the record is sealed?" The room fell into a suffocating silence. On the screen, another clip played, audio from Collins's own body cam. His voice was clear. "Dude's really going off on this one. Thinks she's actually somebody important." Hale's voice replied, "Nah man. Probably just another welfare queen." Then laughter. The gallery hissed in disgust. Naomi muted the audio, leaving the screen frozen on the court seal. "Identity verification is complete," she said firmly. "That is this court seal. Behind me you see my name engraved on the bench. I have presided here for 23 years. And this morning, Officer Mercer assaulted the presiding judge of this very courthouse." The shock in the room was absolute. Mercer sat pale, sweat dripping down his temple. A.D.A. Myers rose, flustered. Your Honor, the prosecution requests a recess to review procedure and verify. Naomi raised her hand slightly, silencing her. The prosecution will have its turn. For now, we proceed with evidence. Her finger tapped the tablet, bringing up timestamps. 8 hours 47 minutes and 13 seconds. Contact. 8 hours 47 minutes and 19 seconds. Slap. 8 hours 47 minutes and 24 seconds. Cuffs. 8 hours 47 minutes and 31 seconds. Slur. Each second etched into record, each frame a nail sealing Mercer's false story. She looked directly at him. You swore to tell the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth. Is there any statement you wish to correct? Mercer opened his mouth, then shut it. His silence was louder than words. Naomi set the tablet down, her expression unshaken. The preservation order has been issued. All relevant devices are sealed. Multi-point backups are secured. Any attempt to interfere with this evidence will be treated as obstruction of justice. She tapped the gavel once. The sound reverberated like a thunderclap. The courtroom no longer felt like Mercer's stage. The ground beneath him had shifted. The authority he thought belonged to his badge had been shattered by truth, and by the judge he had tried to humiliate. The air inside the courtroom was no longer heavy with Mercer's false authority, it now pulsed with the weight of undeniable truth. Naomi Carter sat at the bench, her black robe flowing like a shadow of order restored. The gavel rested firmly in her hand, engraved words gleaming under the lights. Justice is blind, but she sees all. For the first time that morning, Mercer looked small. His broad shoulders slumped as if the badge pinned to his chest had lost its shine. Hale and Collins, who only minutes ago had played along with his lies, now sat stiff, their faces pale, their eyes darting toward the exits like trapped animals searching for a way out. Naomi adjusted her glasses slightly, her gaze steady. We will now move forward, she said, her tone measured but carrying authority that filled every corner of the room. This court will examine not only the incident of this morning but the broader conduct of Officer Daniel Mercer. A ripple of shock passed through the gallery. This was no longer a simple dispute. Naomi was widening the lens, pulling Mercer's entire record into view. She gestured toward Bailiff Green. Please bring forward the sealed binder. Green stepped forward with a thick binder of disciplinary reports and citizen complaints gathered over Mercer's 15 years of service. He placed it carefully on the bench, the weight of it landing with a dull thud that echoed through the chamber. Naomi flipped the first page. Her eyes scanned quickly, then she spoke, her voice calm but cutting. 47 complaints filed against Officer Mercer during his career. 47. Each one concluded as insufficient evidence. Murmurs spread through the room. She turned another page. 87% of arrests made by this officer involved people of color, in a precinct where only 58% of residents belong to minority groups. The disparity is statistically significant. Mercer shifted uncomfortably. His lawyer, a court-appointed defender named Michael Hart, leaned toward him, whispering urgently. But Naomi continued, flipping to another chart. Use of force documented in 63% of Mercer's cases involving minorities, compared to just 12% when the subject was white. She paused, lifting her gaze from the papers to the gallery. Numbers don't convict on their own, but together they reveal a pattern that cannot be ignored. The stenographer's keys tapped furiously, recording every word. Naomi flipped to specific cases. 2009, Rosa Delgado, age 63, reported racial slurs and was forced onto the hood of a car after asking for a badge number. Concluded, insufficient evidence. 2012, Jamal Watkins, age 17, alleged that drugs were planted after refusing to inform on his brother. Concluded, insufficient evidence. 2016, Dr. Michael Johnson, detained outside his own home because he did not fit the neighborhood. Held for 6 hours. Concluded, insufficient evidence. Gasps rippled through the gallery. Naomi lifted her head, locking eyes with Mercer. 432 cases tied to your testimony, Officer Mercer. Nearly 40% of them dismissed or overturned due to constitutional violations or procedural misconduct. In total, your actions have cost taxpayers over $2 million in settlements. Mercer's breathing quickened. Sweat dotted his forehead. Naomi leaned back slightly. Tell me, Officer Mercer, how do you explain a record so drastically different from your peers? Mercer's lips parted, but no words came out. He looked to Hart, who placed a steadying hand on his sleeve, whispering, "Say nothing." Naomi tapped the gavel lightly. "Very well. Silence is your right. But silence also speaks." She turned toward ADA Myers. "The court orders immediate production of Mercer's last 6 months of body cam footage, upload logs, and any administrative notes regarding his conduct. Additionally, I request Chief Judge Margaret Ellis to authorize multi-point backups of all courthouse surveillance from this morning. Every case involving Officer Mercer over the past 5 years will also be reviewed." Myers stood reluctantly, her voice uneven. "Your Honor, the prosecution will comply." Naomi's eyes narrowed. "Not just comply, Ms. Myers. Cooperate fully. The public's trust depends on transparency." The tension in the room thickened. Hale and Collins exchanged nervous glances. They knew their own involvement was about to unravel. Naomi tapped the tablet again, replaying the earlier body cam audio. Mercer's sneering words filled the room once more. People like her need to learn their place. She muted the video and looked out at the gallery. This is what happens when prejudice meets unchecked power. It transforms into sanctioned violence. Her voice carried firm conviction. This court will not allow that to continue. She shifted her focus back to Mercer. "You swore an oath when you put on that uniform." "I have it here." She lifted a printed copy of his officer's oath and read aloud, "I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution, to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office." She lowered the page slowly. This morning, none of those words applied. The gavel struck once. The sharp crack echoed like judgment itself. Naomi then turned her attention to Hale and Collins. "You two confirmed under oath that Officer Mercer's actions were proper. But we now have clear evidence that they were not. This court orders both of your personal devices to be sealed and entered into evidence immediately. From this point on, all of your statements will be under oath, and any further dishonesty will be treated as perjury." The bailiff stepped forward, collecting their phones. Hale's hands shook as he handed his over. Collins avoided eye contact, his face flushed with fear. Naomi leaned forward, her voice calm but razor-sharp. "Let me remind you both, perjury and obstruction of justice are not minor mistakes. They carry consequences that this court will enforce without hesitation." The courtroom sat in stunned silence. The balance of power had completely shifted. Just hours earlier, Naomi had been shoved, insulted, and paraded in chains. Now, every lie that Mercer and his fellow officers had built was collapsing under the weight of truth. Naomi lifted the gavel, pausing for a brief moment before speaking again. "This court will recess for 10 minutes. When we return, we will address Officer Mercer's change of status from witness to defendant and begin setting conditions for detention and evidence review." She struck the gavel firmly. "Court is in recess." The sound echoed like a verdict already given. When the gavel struck to call the recess, the entire courtroom seemed to breathe for the first time in hours. Yet that breath was shallow, uneasy, like a room where everyone knew the air had changed but no one dared say it aloud. Naomi Carter stepped back into her private chamber, her robe flowing behind her. The engraved gavel still weighed in her hand, steadying her as she closed the door against the noise of the gallery. For a moment she leaned against the desk, inhaling deeply. The bruise on her cheek pulsed faintly under the light, reminding her of the violence she had endured just outside those doors. But now that mark was no longer a weakness, it was evidence, a scarlet banner of truth. Bailiff Thomas Green entered quietly, carrying sealed envelopes of phone data and body cam backups collected during the recess. "Your Honor," he said, voice firm now, "all devices have been taken into custody and logged. The technicians are preparing mirror copies for immediate review." Naomi nodded. "Good. Every second matters." The lies unravel faster when facts are preserved. When the recess ended, the courtroom filled again, but the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. Lawyers, clerks, and even bystanders whispered anxiously, some craning their necks to catch a glimpse of Naomi as she re-entered. The dignity in her stride silenced them. "All rise." Green's voice thundered as Naomi approached the bench. Everyone stood, not out of habit, but out of a dawning realization. They were in the presence of a judge who had turned humiliation into a weapon of truth. Naomi seated herself, her eyes sweeping the room. "This court is back in session. We will now address the status of Officer Daniel Mercer." She let the name hang in the air, her tone slicing through the silence. "After review of evidence already presented, Mercer is no longer a witness. He is now a defendant in this court." Gasps rippled across the gallery. Mercer's face drained of color. His lawyer, Michael Hart, shot to his feet. "Objection, Your Honor. This is an unprecedented shift without proper process." Naomi raised her hand slightly. "Mr. Hart, sit down. The law is clear. When a witness provides false testimony under oath, commits perjury, and engages in acts of violence under color of authority, the court has the right and responsibility to recognize that witness as a defendant." Hart's jaw tightened, but he obeyed, pulling Mercer down beside him. Naomi turned to ADA Rachel Myers. "Prosecution, your position on custodial status?" Myers stood slowly. She was pale, clearly shaken, but her professionalism held. "Your Honor, given the evidence, the state requests remand without bail. Officer Mercer poses a significant risk of obstruction and potential tampering with evidence." Hart jumped in. "Your Honor, my client denies these allegations. We propose conditional bail, restricted witness contact, and monitored access to evidence." Naomi's gaze sharpened. Conditional bail would be an insult to the very process he tried to corrupt. This morning's body cam footage alone establishes direct evidence of perjury, unlawful assault, and civil rights violations. She paused, her voice tightening. "Remand pending trial is the only option." The gavel came down firmly. "So ordered." Mercer's breathing quickened. His lips trembled as he turned toward Hart. But Hart's eyes told him there was no escape. For the first time in years, the badge could not protect him. Naomi shifted her gaze to Hale and Collins. "From this point forward, Officers Victor Hale and Brian Collins, all of your statements are under oath. Your personal devices are sealed, your communications logged. Any attempt to obstruct will be prosecuted immediately as perjury and obstruction of justice." The two officers nodded stiffly, fear written across their faces. Naomi lifted a printed copy of the police oath again, reading it slowly. "I solemnly swear to support and defend the Constitution, to faithfully and impartially discharge the duties of my office." She set the paper down deliberately. This morning, those words were trampled on the courthouse steps. She let the silence linger before continuing. "The time has come to restore them." Naomi turned to Green. "Please bring forward the compiled data set." Green carried a thick binder and placed it before her. Naomi opened it, revealing charts, graphs, and detailed disciplinary histories. "This court will now review the broader patterns of misconduct associated with Officer Mercer," she said. "We will not only examine the slap heard this morning. We will examine the years of bias, the systemic failures, and the cost of blind trust in a uniform." The gallery sat stunned, as though history itself had slowed to watch. Naomi read aloud the numbers. Use of force disparities, disproportionate arrests, racial slurs embedded in officer reports. Each line was a stone laid on Mercer's shoulders, pressing him lower into his chair. She turned to ADA Myers. "The prosecution will also expand discovery to include all cases involving Mercer's testimony for the past 5 years. Every conviction, every detention, every file, reviewed for constitutional violations." Myers swallowed hard, but her voice held steady. "Understood, Your Honor. We will comply." Naomi then faced the gallery, her voice resonating with quiet power. "Let this be clear. No one stands above the law. Not a uniform, not a badge, not a robe. Authority without accountability is not justice. It is violence." Her eyes locked on Mercer. "Officer Mercer, you once said, people like her need to learn their place. Today you will learn that your place is not above the law. It is under it just like everyone else." The gavel struck sharply, and for the first time since the trial began, the courtroom erupted in applause, not loud, not chaotic, but steady like a wave of relief. Green called for order, but Naomi did not silence them immediately. For once, the sound of justice felt earned. Finally, she raised her hand and the room quieted again. "This court will reconvene in 20 minutes to issue preliminary rulings on charges based on the evidence reviewed so far." She tapped the gavel one final time. "Court is in recess." As the crowd rose, the image of Officer Mercer slumped beside his lawyer, eyes lowered, hands trembling, became the defining symbol of the morning. A man who once carried unchecked power now stripped of it, sitting like any other defendant before the law. When the gavel struck again, silence fell over the courtroom like a curtain. Every person in the gallery, from seasoned lawyers to young clerks, leaned forward, sensing that history was being written before their eyes. Naomi Carter sat steady at the bench, the black robe draped firmly across her shoulders. The bruise on her cheek had darkened, but her voice carried with unbroken strength. "This session," she began, "will move beyond speculation. We now turn to facts, evidence, and consequences." She tapped her gavel lightly, and Bailiff Thomas Green placed a thick folder on the bench. Inside were detailed reports, complaint records, and technical data from body cams and courthouse cameras. Naomi opened it carefully, scanning the first page before looking up. "Officer Daniel Mercer," she said, her tone precise, "this morning you testified under oath that I attempted to trespass, carried stolen documents, and resisted lawful commands. We now know that every element of that testimony was false. The evidence shows otherwise. Therefore, this court recognizes your testimony as perjury in the first degree." Mercer's eyes widened, but he remained silent. His attorney, Michael Hart, placed a firm hand on his shoulder, whispering urgently. Naomi continued, her voice sharp and unwavering. "Preliminary indictment, Count 1, felony assault. Count 2, assault on a judicial officer performing her duty. Count 3, deprivation of constitutional rights under color of law. Count 4, perjury." Each charge landed like a hammer blow, the weight of law pressing harder against Mercer's chest. The stenographer's keys clattered rapidly, capturing every word that would define the record. Naomi paused and scanned the gallery. "Does the prosecution have a position on these preliminary indictments?" ADA Rachel Meyer stood slowly, clutching her pen so tightly her knuckles turned white. "Your Honor," she said cautiously, "the evidence presented so far provides sufficient basis for these charges. The state requests remand without bail until trial, given the risk of obstruction and tampering." Naomi nodded once. "Request granted." Hart immediately rose. "Your Honor, this is a miscarriage of due process. My client has served honorably for 15 years. He deserves the presumption of innocence." Naomi fixed her gaze on him. "Mr. Hart, your client's record does not show honor. It shows a pattern of misconduct, abuse, and dishonesty. Presumption of innocence protects him in trial. But today the evidence is overwhelming. Custody until trial is necessary to preserve justice." She struck the gavel sharply. "So ordered." Mercer slumped back in his chair, the weight of the words crushing him. Naomi then turned her attention to Hale and Collins, her eyes narrowing. "Officers Hale and Collins, you testified under oath that my actions were threatening and that I resisted restraint. We now have recordings from your body cams confirming otherwise." The large screen flickered to life again. The courtroom watched as the video replayed Collins's voice. "Dude's really going off on this one. Think she's actually somebody important." Hale's reply came next. "Nah man. Probably just another welfare queen." The faint sound of laughter followed. The gallery hissed in disgust. Naomi muted the video and spoke directly to the two officers. "Would either of you like to revise your testimony before the record is sealed?" Neither man spoke. Hale's jaw tightened and Collins lowered his head, unable to look at the bench. "Very well," Naomi said, her voice cold but steady. Your silence will be recorded as refusal to correct false testimony. Both of you are now under direct investigation for perjury and obstruction of justice. Your devices remain in custody. Your communications are logged. Any further dishonesty will lead to immediate prosecution in this courtroom. Bailiff Green collected more sealed evidence from the clerk's desk and handed it to Naomi. She lifted the documents, showing the gallery charts and figures. Here are the numbers, she said firmly. 47 citizen complaints. 432 cases tied to Officer Mercer. Nearly 40% of those cases dismissed due to misconduct or constitutional violations. And over $2 million in taxpayer funds lost to settlements. She flipped to another page. Use of force recorded in 63% of minority-related cases. 12% when the subject was white. That disparity is not random. It is systematic. Her eyes swept across the courtroom. Numbers do not lie. They reveal truth that words try to bury. Mercer shifted uncomfortably in his chair, his face pale. Hale and Collins sat rigid, sweat gathering at their temples. Even Myers, who had initially trusted the officer's accounts, pressed her lips together, her expression dark with shame. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Her voice was calm but sharp, the kind that cut deeper because it never wavered. Officer Mercer, you once said in this very courtroom, people like her always play the victim card. Not in my courthouse. Let me remind you, this is not your courthouse. This is the people's court. And here, actions have consequences. The gavel struck once, reverberating through the chamber. From this moment forward, Naomi continued, this court will proceed with the review of all body cam footage, internal reports, and disciplinary records tied to Officer Mercer. The prosecution and the police department are ordered to cooperate fully. All supplemental statements will be taken under oath. She paused, scanning the room again. No one, no officer, no attorney, no judge, will stand above accountability in this chamber. The gallery sat silent, some clerks staring at the floor, others shifting uncomfortably in their seats. But beneath the silence was something new, recognition. Recognition that the system was no longer turning a blind eye. Naomi lifted the gavel one last time. This court will recess for 10 minutes. When we return, we will finalize preliminary detention conditions and schedule evidentiary review. She struck the bench with a sharp crack. Court is in recess. As the crowd rose, their eyes fixed on Mercer. The man who once strutted with unchecked confidence now looked like a shell, his hands trembling, his eyes darting to the ground. Hale and Collins sat frozen, realizing that their own downfall was no longer a possibility, it was inevitable. And above it all, Naomi Carter sat firm at the bench, a living reminder that the robe she wore and the gavel she held were not symbols of privilege, but of responsibility, and that responsibility was now being fulfilled in its purest form. The courtroom doors opened once more, and the buzz of hushed voices dropped into silence as Bailiff Thomas Green's command filled the room. All rise. Court is back in session. Everyone stood, their eyes fixed on Naomi Carter as she walked back to the bench. Her stride was calm, but each step carried the weight of someone who had already decided that no truth, no matter how buried, would remain hidden today. She seated herself, lifted the gavel, and gave a single measured strike. Be seated. The gallery obeyed, but the stillness in the room was charged. It was the silence of people realizing that they were about to witness something far larger than a single officer's downfall. Naomi straightened the binder Green had laid on the bench earlier. Her voice rang clear, cutting into the tension. This court will now examine the systemic patterns tied to Officer Mercer's record, as well as the institutional failures that allowed those patterns to persist. She opened the binder and read aloud. 47 citizen complaints, each stamped with the phrase, insufficient evidence. That phrase has become a shield, repeated so often it no longer serves justice, only convenience. Her eyes swept across the gallery, then returned to the papers. Let us consider specific cases. 2009, Rosa Delgado, age 63. Reported being called racial slurs. Forced onto the hood of a car after asking for an officer's badge number. Conclusion: insufficient evidence. 2012, Jamal Watkins, age 17. Alleged drugs planted during an arrest. Refused to inform on his brother. Conclusion: insufficient evidence. 2016, Dr. Michael Johnson, detained outside his own home for not fitting the neighborhood. Held for 6 hours. Conclusion: insufficient evidence. She closed the binder softly but deliberately. When a phrase is repeated again and again, it ceases to be a conclusion and becomes a script. Naomi tapped her tablet, and a large screen displayed excerpts from Mercer's old arrest reports. Phrases repeated with eerie uniformity: acting erratically, refused to comply, threatened officer safety. Language creates reality, Naomi said firmly. When abused, it distorts reality into something unrecognizable. This language became Mercer's weapon. He did not need truth. He needed only the same words repeated enough to become believable. The stenographer's keys tapped quickly, the sound almost frantic as every word entered the record. Naomi turned to ADA Rachel Myers. "Do you see any objective justification for this pattern?" Myers hesitated, then spoke with an edge of shame. "At this time, Your Honor, no." Naomi gave a slow nod. "Then we must face what the evidence shows. This is not a story of a single officer losing control. This is a story of a system that allowed him to continue unchecked." Her gaze landed on Mercer. He sat rigid, sweat dripping down his temple, his lawyer whispering frantically in his ear. But Naomi pressed forward, her voice unwavering. "Officer Mercer, in this very courtroom, you swore to support and defend the Constitution. Yet this morning, you violated that oath with every word you spoke. You placed prejudice above duty. Power above law." She lifted another file from the binder. "In the last 5 years alone, 432 cases carried your name. Nearly 40% of them were dismissed, overturned, or reduced due to constitutional violations. That is not chance. That is a pattern." Naomi tapped the gavel lightly. The sound was calm, but it carried the weight of a warning. "This court orders immediate review of every one of those cases. I have directed Chief Judge Margaret Ellis to secure backups of courthouse footage and upload logs. The Department of Justice will be notified, and the FBI Civil Rights Division will receive full access to all records." Gasps rippled through the gallery. The scale of what Naomi was unleashing was clear. This was no longer a local scandal. It was becoming a federal matter. Naomi turned her focus back to Hale and Collins. "And you too," she said, her voice steady but sharp. "You chose to stand silent while false testimony was given. You nodded in agreement as lies were spoken. You laughed on your body cams at a woman you believed to be powerless." She leaned forward slightly, her eyes piercing. "But that powerless woman is the presiding judge of this courthouse. And today your silence has become your indictment." Hale's lips tightened. Collins stared at the floor, his hands trembling on the table. Naomi tapped the gavel again. "Your phones are now evidence. Your messages will be examined. Any attempt to delete or alter them will be considered obstruction of justice, punishable in this courtroom without delay." She paused, allowing the weight of the words to settle. Then she addressed the entire gallery, her voice deep and commanding. "Let no one mistake this moment. What happened on these courthouse steps was not an isolated incident. It was the product of years of habits, shielded by empty phrases and ignored complaints. But those habits end today. Because justice is not a slogan on a wall, it is a process. A process that demands accountability." Her eyes found Mercer once more. His face was pale, his chest heaving with shallow breaths. "Officer Mercer, you once said, people like her need to learn their place. Do you know your place now? Your place is in the defendant's chair, under the same law you once twisted to humiliate others. That is the consequence of your actions." The gavel came down hard, the sound reverberating through the courtroom. For the first time, even the officers in uniform seated along the walls lowered their heads. The badge that had once given Mercer power now seemed like a chain dragging him down. Naomi leaned back, her voice steady as stone. "This court will reconvene in 15 minutes. When we return, we will address custody conditions and announce the evidentiary schedule. Until then, let it be clear, no one in this room, no matter their rank, stands above the law. The gavel struck again. Court is in recess. As the room stirred, whispers rushed like wind through the gallery. Mercer sat frozen, Hale and Collins pale as ghosts, and Myers scribbled furiously in her notebook. But above the chaos, one truth rang louder than everything else: the tide had turned. The system that once protected lies was now forced to face them head-on. And at the center of it all sat Naomi Carter, the bruise on her cheek no longer a mark of shame, but the seal of a judge who refused to bow to silence. The room was still buzzing when Bailiff Thomas Green's call silenced the gallery once again. All rise. Court is back in session. Everyone stood, but this time it was not just routine. The audience had begun to understand that they weren't simply observing a case. They were witnessing the unraveling of a culture that had been protected for years. Naomi Carter stepped forward, her black robe flowing as she returned to her chair. She tapped the gavel once. Be seated. The room fell quiet. Naomi glanced down at the binder of reports and then back at the courtroom. This court has reviewed preliminary data, and the pattern is undeniable. Officer Mercer's conduct is not an anomaly. It is a symptom of systemic failure. She looked directly at ADA Rachel Myers. Prosecution, you will now address this court. How do you explain the state's repeated decision to dismiss 47 citizen complaints, all concluded with the phrase, insufficient evidence? Myers shifted in her seat, her jaw tightening. She stood, clutching her pen like it might anchor her. Your Honor, the office handled complaints based on the materials presented by the department. If body cams failed or reports lacked detail, it limited our ability to proceed. Naomi's voice sharpened. Then let us call things by their proper name. The failures were not due to lack of evidence. They were due to lack of preservation, lack of disclosure, and at times, deliberate suppression. That is not justice, it is neglect. The gallery stirred uneasily. Naomi's words were not just condemning one officer but an entire process. She continued, her tone deliberate. From this point forward, every claim of equipment malfunction will trigger automatic review by an independent body. Prosecutors will no longer accept officer statements at face value when technology exists to confirm them. If evidence goes missing, accountability will follow. Her eyes shifted to Mercer. He sat slumped, staring at the table in front of him, sweat glistening at his temples. Hart, his lawyer, whispered rapidly in his ear, but Mercer didn't move. Naomi tapped the gavel again. Furthermore, the Department of Justice and the FBI Civil Rights Division have been contacted. This court orders full access to Officer Mercer's records and to all cases in which his testimony was central. Gasps rippled through the room. Even Myers's eyes widened. Federal oversight was no longer a possibility, it was a reality. Naomi pressed on. All detention decisions linked to Mercer's testimony will be re-examined. Any individual currently incarcerated solely on his reports is entitled to immediate review for bail or release. The gallery erupted in murmurs, clerks whispering to each other, attorneys scribbling notes. 4 families of those imprisoned under Mercer's shadow, hope had just been spoken aloud. Naomi raised her voice slightly. Order. The room quieted again. This is not vengeance. This is correction. Justice requires not only punishing misconduct but undoing its damage. She shifted her gaze to Hale and Collins. Officers Hale and Collins, your conduct is also under review. The body cam footage we have already seen confirms that you were complicit in both misconduct and dishonesty. You will remain under oath. Your personal devices are sealed. From this point, any further attempt to obstruct or lie will bring immediate indictment. Hale swallowed hard. Collins's head dropped lower, his face hidden in his hands. Naomi leaned back slightly, her eyes sweeping the gallery. Let this be clear, the so-called blue wall of silence has no standing in this courtroom. The habit of covering for one another, of nodding to lies, ends here. Silence in the face of misconduct is complicity. Complicity is guilt. The stenographer's keys clattered, immortalizing every word. Naomi then addressed Myers once more. Prosecution: this court directs your office to establish open file discovery by default. No evidence will remain hidden, no malfunction excused, no checklist ignored. If your office fails, this court will recommend sanctions. Myers's face was pale, but she nodded. Yes, Your Honor. We will implement it immediately. Naomi gave a curt nod. Very well. She then returned her gaze to Mercer. Her voice dropped lower, carrying a cold clarity. Officer Mercer, for 15 years you built a career on intimidation and deception. You hid behind phrases like acting erratically and resisting commands, words that were never about truth but about control. This morning, you tried to use those same words on me. Mercer finally looked up, his eyes glassy. For the first time, he seemed to realize that the ground beneath him had given way. Naomi leaned forward slightly, her eyes locked on his. But words lose their power when the truth stands against them. Today the truth has spoken. She tapped the gavel once. This court now schedules evidentiary review within 10 days. All body cam footage from the last 6 months, all internal reports, all complaints, and all disciplinary records tied to Mercer are to be reviewed by this court and by federal authorities. She paused, her voice deepening. This is no longer about one officer. It is about a culture. And cultures can be changed only when exposed. The gallery sat in stunned silence. For years, many had whispered doubts, but now those doubts were confirmed under oath, on record, with evidence undeniable. Naomi tapped the gavel again. Court will recess for 20 minutes. When we return, we will finalize preliminary rulings on charges and outline the next steps for federal coordination. She rose from the bench, her robe sweeping as she stepped away. Green's voice rang out again, all rise. Everyone stood as Naomi walked out, her head high, her pace steady. Behind her, the officers who once believed they owned the courthouse now sat powerless, their silence as loud as any confession. The 20 minutes of recess felt like hours. Conversations buzzed in the gallery, clerks shuffled papers nervously, and attorneys whispered into phones, their voices low but urgent. Everyone knew what was coming. The question was not if justice would fall, but how hard. When Bailiff Thomas Green's voice rang out again, it carried a weight heavier than before. All rise. Court is back in session. The crowd stood. Naomi Carter entered with the same steady composure she had carried all day. The black robe framed her shoulders like armor, the engraved gavel glinting faintly in her hand. She sat, straightened her notes, and struck the bench once. Be seated. The room fell silent, the tension sharp enough to cut. Naomi's voice was calm, but every word carried precision. This court has reviewed evidence, testimony, and records from this morning's proceedings. The facts are no longer in dispute. We now issue preliminary rulings. The stenographer's keys tapped quickly, preparing to record what everyone knew would become history. Naomi turned her eyes directly to Mercer. Officer Daniel Mercer, based on direct evidence including courthouse surveillance, body cam backups, and your own sworn testimony, this court finds sufficient grounds for the following charges: felony assault, assault on a judicial officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, and perjury in the first degree. Gasps swept through the gallery. Mercer's face went pale. His attorney, Michael Hart, shot to his feet. Your Honor, objection. Conflict of interest. You cannot preside over a case in which you are the victim. Naomi raised a hand slightly. Objection noted. The record will be transferred to a neutral panel at the post-trial stage. But in emergencies, the law allows this court to establish preliminary liability when obstruction and risk are clear. Today both are undeniable. Hart sat slowly, defeated, as Mercer stared blankly at the bench. Naomi continued, her voice even but unyielding. Custody without bail is confirmed. The defendant will remain remanded pending trial. Evidence review begins within 10 days. Preliminary hearings will follow. The gavel struck once, sealing Mercer's fate. Naomi then turned her gaze to Hale and Collins. The two officers sat rigid, their faces pale, hands twitching nervously on the table. Officers Victor Hale and Brian Collins, Naomi said, her tone cutting, you knowingly provided false testimony in this courtroom. Your body cam recordings prove that you supported a fabricated story. Therefore, this court recognizes sufficient grounds for perjury and obstruction of justice. The gallery erupted in shocked murmurs. Some gasped, others whispered furiously. Green raised his hand. Order in the court. Naomi pressed on. Your personal devices are now evidence. Your communications are under review. Until further ruling, you are suspended from duty effective immediately. Any attempt to interfere with this investigation will lead to additional charges. Collins's face dropped into his hands. Hale clenched his jaw, staring at the table as if it could swallow him whole. Naomi shifted her focus back to the prosecution. Ms. Myers, your office will fully cooperate in reviewing every case tied to Mercer, Hale, and Collins. Discovery will be open file by default. Any failure to disclose evidence will be treated as prosecutorial misconduct. Myers nodded stiffly, her lips pressed tight. Understood, Your Honor. Naomi adjusted her glasses slightly, then addressed the entire courtroom. Her voice carried across every seat, every corner. Let the record show that justice is not a slogan, nor a shield for misconduct. Justice is accountability applied equally without exception. Today that accountability begins here. She tapped her tablet, and the large screen displayed timestamps once again. 8 hours 47 minutes and 13 seconds. Contact. 8 hours 47 minutes and 19 seconds. Slap. 8 hours 47 minutes and 24 seconds. Cuffs. 8 hours 47 minutes and 31 seconds. Slur. Naomi's voice sharpened. Each second of this footage is a nail in the coffin of false testimony. Each timestamp erases another lie. And every frame stands as a reminder that cameras do not lie, people do. She looked directly at Mercer. You said, people like her need to learn their place. Today you have learned yours. Your place is in the defendant's chair, stripped of authority, stripped of pretense, and subject to the same law you once twisted to humiliate others. The gavel came down hard, the sound echoing like a verdict even though trial was still to come. The gallery sat frozen. Clerks exchanged stunned glances, attorneys scribbled furiously in their pads, and community members in the back whispered words like, finally, and about time. Naomi leaned back slightly, her tone softening just enough to cut deeper. This court does not stand above the people. It stands with them. The badge does not erase accountability. Neither does the robe. Justice is not a privilege, it is a responsibility. She struck the gavel once more. Court will reconvene tomorrow morning at 9 to begin evidentiary review and detention conditions. Bailiff Green's voice thundered again, all rise. The gallery stood as Naomi Carter left the bench. But this time they did not rise out of habit. They rose because they had just witnessed truth standing taller than lies. The next morning, the courthouse was already packed before the session began. Reporters crowded the steps, families of past complainants filled the gallery, and clerks whispered nervously as they shuffled papers. Everyone knew that what had started with one officer's arrogance was now about to expose years of hidden pain. When Bailiff Thomas Green called the court to order, the room rose in silence. Naomi Carter entered the chamber, her robe falling in dark folds, the engraved gavel steady in her hand. The bruise on her cheek had begun to fade, but it remained a visible reminder of what had sparked this moment. She sat, adjusted her glasses, and struck the bench once. Be seated. The room settled, though tension hung thick in the air. Naomi opened a file before her, a list of names highlighted across several pages. Her eyes swept the room before she spoke. Yesterday, this court reviewed the misconduct of Officer Mercer, along with the complicity of Officers Hale and Collins. But justice cannot stop with numbers and charges. Behind every statistic is a person, a life interrupted, a dignity stripped away. Today we speak their names. The stenographer's keys began their rhythmic tapping as Naomi read aloud. Rosa Delgado, 63 years old. Shoved onto the hood of a car for asking an officer's badge number. No apology. No accountability. She paused, letting the words settle before continuing. Jamal Watkins, 17 years old. Drugs allegedly planted after he refused to cooperate against a relative. Branded as a criminal before he even reached adulthood. A ripple of murmurs ran through the gallery. Dr. Michael Johnson. Handcuffed outside his own home because he was judged not to fit the neighborhood. 6 hours detained. A lifetime scar left behind. Naomi closed the file softly. Her voice was calm, but it carried the weight of years. These are not just names. They are stories of people who trusted the system and were betrayed by it. She looked out at the gallery, her eyes sweeping across families and community members. For too long, their voices were silenced by the words insufficient evidence. But today their truth is on record. Their dignity is restored. Mercer shifted uncomfortably at the defendant's table, his lawyer whispering urgently in his ear. Hale stared straight ahead, jaw clenched. Collins kept his head down, his hands folded tightly as if in prayer. Naomi tapped the gavel lightly. Officer Mercer, your misconduct was not only an attack on individuals. It was an attack on the office you swore to uphold. You slapped not just a woman on courthouse steps, you slapped the Constitution itself. And the Constitution will not stay silent. The gallery erupted in murmurs, some nodding, others whispering amen under their breath. Green called for order, but Naomi allowed the voices to linger a moment longer. She continued, her tone firm but solemn. Let us remember, power without accountability is not protection, it is violence. The badge is not a shield from consequence. It is a promise to serve fairly, a promise broken here again and again. Naomi reached for another folder filled with statistical charts. 432 cases tied to Officer Mercer's name. Nearly 40% dismissed or overturned. That is not chance. That is not error. That is systemic. She tapped the charts with her gavel, each tap echoing like a drumbeat. 47 complaints stamped insufficient evidence. Year after year ignored. Each one of those stamps was a nail in the coffin of public trust. Her eyes locked on Mercer. And you wielded that stamp like a weapon. Mercer lowered his gaze, his hands trembling. Naomi turned her focus back to the gallery. But this court is not here to bury the truth. It is here to uncover it. That is why we are reopening those complaints. That is why every conviction tied to Mercer's false testimony will be reviewed. And that is why today we say clearly, no one stands above the law. The gallery rose in applause, restrained but resolute. Green called for silence, but Naomi did not scold the crowd. She let the sound wash through the chamber like a cleansing wave before raising her hand. Order. The room quieted. Naomi leaned forward slightly. Her voice softened, but it carried with equal strength. This is not vengeance. This is not anger. This is responsibility. Responsibility to those who filed complaints and were ignored. Responsibility to the families who lost sons, daughters, neighbors, and friends to silence. Responsibility to the people whose lives were marked forever by the words, insufficient evidence. She glanced at Hale and Collins. You sat by and nodded to lies. You laughed at someone you thought was powerless. But you will face your own consequences. Perjury and obstruction will not be brushed aside in this court. Both men stiffened but remained silent. Naomi tapped her gavel once more. We now move to federal coordination. The Department of Justice has been notified. The FBI Civil Rights Division will receive full records from this court, including body cam backups, disciplinary logs, and communication records. The era of closed doors is over. The gallery erupted again, this time not with murmurs, but with a low wave of clapping that grew into a standing ovation from the back rows. Green's voice thundered for order, but Naomi did not raise her hand immediately. She allowed the applause to fill the chamber for a few moments, a sound that echoed years of silence finally breaking. When it faded, she spoke again, her voice steady and clear. This court will reconvene tomorrow to continue evidentiary review and schedule hearings for charges against Mercer, Hale, and Collins. Until then, let it be clear, the people of this city will no longer hear insufficient evidence as an excuse. They will hear truth. They will see accountability. She raised the gavel high and struck it with finality. Court is adjourned. The sound rang like a bell, reverberating not only in the courtroom but in the hearts of those who had waited too long for justice to speak. The courtroom was fuller than ever on the final day. Reporters lined the aisles, families filled every seat, and the air carried a charge of anticipation. Everyone knew they were about to witness the closing chapter of a story that had already shaken the city to its core. When Bailiff Thomas Green called the court to order, his voice thundered with formality, but it carried something else too, pride. 4 days he had watched Naomi Carter dismantle lies with patience and precision. And now he knew history would be sealed. All rise. Court is back in session. The room stood. Naomi entered, calm but unyielding, her robe trailing as she stepped to the bench. The fading bruise on her cheek was still visible, a quiet reminder of how this all began. She sat, lifted the gavel and struck once. Be seated. The silence was absolute. Naomi glanced at the files before her, then raised her eyes to the room. This court has spent days reviewing evidence, testimony, and systemic patterns of abuse. Today we conclude our work with final rulings and directives. The stenographer's keys clattered at a steady rhythm, recording every word. Naomi turned first to Mercer. He sat pale, hands folded tightly, the bravado that once defined him completely gone. His lawyer sat stiffly beside him, notes untouched. Officer Daniel Mercer, Naomi began, her tone deliberate, you stand before this court charged with felony assault on a judicial officer, deprivation of rights under color of law, and perjury. The evidence is overwhelming. Your own words, captured on video, condemned you. Your record confirms a pattern of abuse. Your testimony in this court was knowingly false. She leaned forward, her eyes locking on him. For 15 years, you used your badge as a weapon. You humiliated, intimidated, and harmed those you were sworn to protect. Today that weapon is stripped from you. You are no longer an officer of the law. You are a convicted criminal. The gallery gasped. Some clapped quietly before Green restored order. Naomi raised the gavel. Sentencing will follow federal coordination, but until then you remain remanded without bail. Your place is no longer behind a badge but behind bars. The gavel struck. Mercer slumped in his chair, his face ashen. Naomi then turned to Hale and Collins. Both men sat rigid, sweat at their temples. Officers Victor Hale and Brian Collins, she said firmly, your complicity is recorded. You lied under oath. You reinforced falsehoods you knew to be untrue. You laughed as rights were trampled. You will answer for perjury and obstruction of justice. Effective immediately, you are stripped of duty and placed under custody pending trial. The gallery murmured. Hale stared straight ahead, his face hard. Collins covered his eyes with his hands, shaking his head slowly as if denial might change the outcome. Naomi tapped the gavel again. The badge is not a shield from truth. You failed your oath. And in this courtroom, failure has consequences. Her words hung heavy in the chamber. But Naomi was not finished. She turned her gaze toward the prosecution table where ADA Rachel Myers sat. This case has revealed not only misconduct by officers, but systemic negligence and oversight. 47 citizen complaints stamped, insufficient evidence. Ignored, dismissed, forgotten. That era ends today. Myers shifted, her face solemn. Naomi continued. From this moment forward, this court mandates independent review panels for all excessive force complaints. Every malfunctioning body cam will trigger an investigation. All prosecutorial files will be opened by default. No evidence will remain hidden. The gallery stirred again. Some nodded in agreement, others whispered, finally. Naomi raised her hand for silence. These reforms are not optional. They are binding. They will be enforced with the same gavel that delivers sentences. She paused, then spoke more softly, her voice resonating with something deeper. This began with a single incident on courthouse steps. But it ends with systemic change. Because justice is not about one person, it is about everyone. The law cannot heal if it is not applied equally. Naomi reached for the list of names she had read the day before. She held it up for the gallery to see. These names will not fade into silence. Their stories are part of this record forever. They remind us that justice delayed is justice denied. But today justice has spoken. Her eyes swept across the room. Let no one misunderstand, this ruling is not revenge. It is not anger. It is responsibility. Responsibility to every citizen who deserves dignity, fairness, and protection under the law. She raised the gavel high, her voice carrying finality. This court rules that Mercer, Hale, and Collins will face full prosecution under state and federal law. Their actions are no longer hidden behind uniforms. Their silence is no longer protection. Their misconduct is no longer ignored. The gavel came down hard. Court is adjourned. The room exploded, not in chaos but in applause. Families rose to their feet, reporters scribbled furiously, and officers along the wall lowered their eyes, some ashamed, some quietly relieved. Green stood tall, his voice booming to maintain order, but even he allowed the applause to linger. As Naomi rose from the bench, she looked across the gallery one last time. Her expression was not one of triumph, but of resolve. She knew the fight was not over. Reforms would face resistance. Change would take time. But the wall of silence had been cracked wide open. And for the first time in years, the people in that courtroom believed that justice had not only spoken, it had finally been heard.